I'm joined with Davis Clay. You are a Texas Master Naturalist. What does that mean? What does a Master Naturalist do?
Hi, Chris. Yes, I'm a Texas Master Naturalist, and Texas Master Naturalists are a group of volunteers. So uh, we work underneath Texas A&M University at various volunteer efforts around the state. Especially, we concentrate on naturalist activities like parks, recreation type of things. We do prairie restoration. We do wetland restoration. We do education outreach, teach kids and adults how to do various things like birding, like taking care of our natural environment.
And I know I've seen some of your posts and things that you've been working on, and you've done a lot of work fighting invasive species. What is an invasive species?
Well, invasive species are species that come into an area, usually from the outside, and they outcompete the local plants and animals. What we call native plants and animals are the ones that were originally there before mankind came. Invasive species tend to be brought in from different localities. They are not subject to the same kind of controls that the native species have evolved to work with. So invasive species may be completely inedible to local wildlife or insects. They may outcompete native species and take over an area.
Okay, so they're basically invaders, kind of like
Invaders.
invasive. Yeah.
They're like plant and animal pandemics.
Yeah, that's appropriate. Um, are there any invasive species that we have to worry about around here?
We have a lot of invasive species. Our number one, especially in our prairies and our forests and wetlands too, is called the Chinese tallow tree. And it was a species that was brought to America, I believe, by Benjamin Franklin about 200 years ago. And it was intended to be a nice, hardy tree that would, uh, in turn, fall colors, especially in the south. And it's one of our only trees down here that actually does show fall colors. But he didn't know when he brought it in that it would take over the world like Chinese tallow does. And we've been fighting it for years and years and years.
Is there any species that it's really affected around here?
Well, it mostly invades our native prairies. Believe it or not, the Houston area and all of South Texas along the coast was originally uh, called coastal prairie, tall grass prairie, and it was composed of mostly tall grasses like big blue stem, little blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, and all these native tall grasses. And so when you would walk around, if you came here back before the white man came, there would just be miles and miles of prairies. Well, what tallow has done is come in, especially since man killed all the bison, and they also have suppressed fires. Generally speaking, prairie fires are very rare and treated like they're the enemy. But back before we took over this area, they were very useful to keep the invasive species like tallow and uh, like there are even native plants that would take over the prairie if it weren't for those things.
And so when they do come in, I guess the species that are living there, they have to deal with that. So what things can they do? I mean, obviously they can die. I mean, that's probably not the choice.
Right.
What else can happen to a species that lives there?
Well, mostly they just get crowded out. They get crowded into smaller and smaller spaces, and eventually, completely eliminated from an area.
Right. So some of them could leave, right? If there was
Uh,
a species that
mhm.
obviously another tree is not going to walk up and leave, but um, something else that if there's not a food source, they might be able to move away to find their food other places.
Right, and other plants can their seeds can be dispersed too. So, even though that particular individual plant can't move, it can spread its seeds around and move its species to a different place.
Right. Is it possible for a species to adapt if given a long enough time that they may be able to get an adaptation to deal with this new species?
So far, we found nothing that will outcompete the tallow tree.
Right.
Has
But
no natural enemies.
the problem is adaptation takes a long time with,
Takes a long time. Yeah,
hundreds or thousands of years. And like you said, this problem's 200 years old. So in the ecological world, this is pretty new.
this is new. And the same thing could happen the other way around. There are plants, native plants around here that if we took them to a different location, or if we took them to China, they might take over the environment in China too, because there aren't the natural enemies of the
Right.
particular organism over there.
Fascinating. Well, that's interesting stuff. You don't really hear about invasive species, especially being plants. We usually think of. I've heard of the lionfish, but some of the plants don't really get as much publicity.
Right, the lionfish and the brown anole and stuff like that.
Interesting stuff. Well, thank you so much. This has been great.
You're welcome. Thank you, Chris.
All right. Have a great day.
You too. Bye-bye.